The air in Ethelgard was like the inside of a diamond, cold, clear, and crushingly expensive. It was an atmosphere engineered to make men feel like kings and to remind everyone else of their place. Marble floors, vast and white, gleamed like frozen rivers under the light of crystal chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling like constellations of captured stars. The hushed clinking of silver on porcelain was the only sound that dared to challenge the cathedral-like silence, a silence that cost more per minute than most people earned in a week. This was a world built on the principle of exclusion, a fortress of wealth where the walls were made of money and the mortar was contempt. Ilara Vance moved through this world like a ghost. Her uniform was a simple, practical black, pressed to a crisp neatness that was a form of defiance in itself. It did not belong here, and neither did she. Her shoes, sensible and worn at the soles, made no sound on the polished marble, a testament to years of practice in the art of being invisible. She was a waitress, a server, a functionary, a pair of hands to deliver the truffle-infused foam and the gold-leaf desserts. To the patrons of Ethelgard, she was less a person and more an extension of the table, a piece of quiet, efficient furniture. Inside, however, Ilara was anything but quiet. Her mind was a library of thoughts, a gallery of memories from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She remembered the scent of old books and chalk dust, the thrill of unraveling a complex philosophical argument in front of a lecture hall of eager students. She had been Professor Vance once, a woman whose worth was measured in ideas and the spark of understanding she could ignite in others. But a single, brutal moment on a rain-slicked highway had burned that library to the ground, leaving her with nothing but ashes, debt, and a grief so vast it had its own gravity. Now, her worth was measured in tips, in her ability to remain silent and unseen. Tonight, the centerpiece of Ethelgard's suffocating opulence was Julian Thorne. He sat at the restaurant's prime table, a throne of plush velvet from which he surveyed his kingdom. Everything about him was sharp and severe, from the cut of his $1,000 suit to the predatory gleam in his eyes. His watch, a sliver of platinum and sapphire, was not a tool for telling time, but a weapon for measuring it in increments of power. He saw the world not as a place to be lived in, but as a balance sheet to be conquered. People were assets or liabilities, opportunities or obstacles. Kindness was a currency for fools. Julian was bored. The fawning laughter of his associates, a trio of men whose spines seemed to have been surgically removed, grated on his nerves. The food, though exquisitely prepared, tasted of nothing. He had built an empire from the rubble of his father's failed ambitions, a towering monument to his own ruthless genius. He had everything a man could want and felt the weight of it all as an immense hollow void. His wealth was a fortress, yes, but it was also a prison, and its coldness had seeped into his bones. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the other patrons, dismissing them all as lesser predators in the same jungle. Then his eyes landed on Ilara. She was refilling a water glass at a nearby table, her movements economical and precise. There was a stillness about her, a self-contained dignity that was utterly out of place in this room of performative arrogance. She was invisible, and that, to Julian, was an intolerable state of being. In his world, one was either powerful or one was dirt. There was no middle ground for quiet dignity. He saw her simple uniform, her plain face, the absence of any jewelry, and a familiar, ugly feeling coiled in his gut: contempt. She was a symbol of everything he had clawed his way up from, a reminder of a powerlessness he would rather die than feel again. He decided, with the casual cruelty of a bored god, to have some sport. He would make her visible. He would make her an object lesson for his sycophants. "You," Julian called out, his voice not loud but sharp enough to cut through the restaurant's decorous hush. It was a voice accustomed to instant obedience, a sound that cracked like a whip. Ilara froze for a fraction of a second. She had not been addressed directly by a patron in months. She was a presence, not a person. She turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral, a mask she had perfected. "Yes, sir?" Every eye in the restaurant swiveled towards them. The clinking of cutlery stopped. A thick, expectant silence fell. Julian Thorne was putting on a show. He beckoned her closer with a flick of his fingers, a gesture one might use for a dog. Ilara walked towards the table, her worn shoes making no sound. She felt the weight of dozens of stares, each one a tiny pinprick against her skin. She kept her gaze focused on a point just past Julian's shoulder, a technique she used to maintain her composure. Julian leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his thin lips. His smile was as cold and sharp as a paper cut. "I have a question for you," he said, his voice laced with theatrical amusement. "A riddle, if you will. I am in a generous mood tonight." His associates chuckled, the sound wet and eager. They knew their role. "I am a man who appreciates value," Julian continued, projecting his voice so the nearby tables could hear. "I believe everything and everyone has a price. I believe that price determines worth, but I find myself puzzled." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. Ilara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back. She felt a familiar, cold dread creeping up her spine, but her face remained a calm, placid lake. "Tell me, waitress," he said, infusing the word with a particular venom. "What has a price but no true worth? What can be owned but never truly held? What is desired by all, yet brings joy to none who possess it?" The riddle hung in the air, slick with malice. It was not a genuine question. It was a trap. It was designed to be unanswerable by someone like her, a creature he imagined had never had a thought more complex than calculating a 15% tip. The riddle was about him, about the gilded cage of his own life. He was asking her to describe the emptiness of his soul, a concept he believed her simple mind could never grasp. He leaned forward, the smirk widening. "Answer my riddle correctly, and I will give you a prize." He gestured to the plate of half-eaten food before him. "I will give you what you have earned in an entire year tonight. A cash tip. Enough to fix whatever it is that is broken in your life." The humiliation was absolute. It was public. It was cruel. And it was designed to reinforce the chasm between their worlds. He wasn't offering her a gift. He was offering her charity for her own debasement. The prize was proof of her poverty, the challenge a proof of her supposed ignorance. His associates roared with laughter this time, a cruel braying sound that echoed in the silent room. Other patrons shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to intervene. Julian Thorne was not a man to be contradicted. Ilara looked at him. For the first time, she met his gaze directly. She saw the glittering emptiness in his eyes, the profound, howling loneliness he mistook for strength. She saw a man so terrified of his own humanity that he had to encase it in layers of gold and cruelty. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The years of forced invisibility, of swallowing her pride, of grieving in silence, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, clear resolve. He thought he was testing her. He had no idea that she was the one administering the exam. The silence in Ethelgard stretched, becoming taut and fragile. Every diner, every member of the staff held their breath. They were watching a public execution of dignity, and the executioner was smiling. Julian Thorne savored the moment, the absolute power he wielded. He watched the waitress, expecting her to stammer, to blush, to apologize for her own inadequacy before slinking away in shame. That was the usual script. But Alara did not blush. She did not stammer. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering, her posture unchanged. The calm on her face was no longer a mask of professional servitude. It was the profound stillness of a deep ocean, unbothered by the storms raging on its surface. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. "Well?" he prompted, his voice hardening. "Has the cat got your tongue? Or is the question too complex for your station?" One of his associates snickered. "Give her a moment, Julian. She's probably trying to remember her multiplication tables." Alara's eyes flickered to the man, a glance so fleeting and sharp, it was like the glint off a shard of glass. The man's smile vanished. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the silent room with perfect clarity. It was a voice that had once commanded lecture halls, a voice accustomed to being heard. "Your riddle has two answers, sir," she said. "The one you want to hear, and the truth." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. This was unexpected. Julian raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. The game had taken an interesting turn. "Oh, indulge me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let's start with the one you think I want to hear." Alara took a small, deliberate breath. "The answer you are looking for is your own fortune," she stated, not as a guess, but as a fact. "It has a price, billions of dollars, a number so large it becomes an abstraction. It can be owned, listed on a stock exchange, but it can never be truly held. It is a phantom that slips through your fingers, a set of numbers on a screen. It is desired by all who do not have it, yet as your own question implies, it has brought you no joy." The room was utterly still. She had taken his veiled, self-pitying riddle and laid its premise bare for all to see. She had diagnosed him as if he were a textbook case study. The smirk was completely gone from Julian's face now, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He felt exposed, dissected by the very creature he had intended to humiliate. "That is a clever guess," Julian said, his voice tight. "But it is not the answer." "I know," Alara replied calmly, "because it is the wrong answer. It is the answer of a man who believes money is the beginning and end of all things. The true answer is far more valuable and far more dangerous." She paused, letting her words sink in. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely inverted. She was no longer the waitress on trial. She was the oracle, and he, the king, was the one being judged. "The correct answer to your riddle," she said, her voice resonating with a profound, unshakable certainty, "is a secret." Julian stared at her, his mind racing. A secret? It was absurd. It was perfect. "Explain," he commanded, the word coming out like a bark. "A secret has a price," Alara elaborated, her tone becoming that of a professor patiently guiding a slow student. "It can be bought with blackmail or sold for 30 pieces of silver. Its price is whatever the keeper is willing to pay to protect it, or what the buyer is willing to pay to exploit it. But it has no intrinsic worth. It is nothing more than information, an absence of light, She took a step closer, her presence suddenly immense. A secret can be owned. You can hold it in your heart like a stone, a burden that shapes the very architecture of your soul. But it can never be truly held. It has no substance, no form. It is a ghost that haunts you. Her eyes bored into his. And a secret is desired by all. We crave gossip. We hunger for hidden knowledge, for the power that comes with knowing something others do not. Yet what joy does a truly heavy secret bring its owner? It brings fear. It brings isolation. It brings a corrosion of the spirit. It is a treasure that turns to poison the moment you acquire it. She fell silent. The power of her logic, the sheer, irrefutable elegance of her answer, washed over the room. It was more than just a clever response. It was a profound philosophical statement. She had not just solved his petty riddle. She had exposed it as a shallow and cynical puzzle, and replaced it with a truth that resonated with a far deeper human experience. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Julian Thorne, the titan of industry, the man who could move markets with a single word, was speechless. He had been intellectually and morally disarmed by a waitress. Then, a new voice broke the silence. It was a calm, authoritative voice, belonging to an older gentleman sitting at Julian's table, a man who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange. This was Alistair Finch, a legendary investor, a man whose quiet nod of approval was worth more than Julian's entire board of directors. "My word," Alistair said, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and profound respect. He was looking not at Julian, but at Ilara. That was extraordinary. He turned his gaze to Julian, and the warmth in his eyes was replaced by an arctic frost. "Julian," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight of immense disappointment. "For years you have lectured me about identifying undervalued assets. It seems you have just publicly humiliated the most valuable asset in this entire building." The aftermath was swift and brutal. Julian Thorne's world, so carefully constructed from steel, glass, and intimidation, began to shatter. The incident did not fade into the awkward memory of a dinner party gone wrong. In the age of the smartphone, nothing ever fades. A guest at a nearby table, a young tech entrepreneur who despised Julian's old money arrogance, had recorded the entire exchange. Before the dessert course was even served, the video was online. It went viral with an explosive, vicious speed. The title was perfect clickbait. "Billionaire humiliates waitress, gets schooled in philosophy." By the time Julian got to his car, his phone was vibrating incessantly, a frantic, buzzing harbinger of his own implosion. His PR chief was calling. His board members were texting. News alerts with his name were popping up like angry welts. The video was everywhere. The court of public opinion had convened, and its verdict was unanimous and damning. He was a monster, a bully, an arrogant fool. But worse than any of that, he had been made to look small. Ilara, for her part, simply finished her shift. She cleared the tables, including Julian's, where his associates had vanished like smoke, leaving Alistair Finch sitting alone, nursing a glass of water. As she reached for a plate, he gently put a hand on her arm. "Miss," he said, his voice kind, "may I ask your name?" "Ilara Vance," she replied. "Mr. Finch," he introduced himself. "Ilara Vance, I have not heard an analysis that sharp and insightful since I took a guest lecture from a Nobel laureate at Cambridge. What you did in there was more than clever. It was wise." He paused, studying her face. "You do not belong in this place." Ilara gave a small, sad smile. Circumstances, Mr. Finch. They have a way of putting us where we don't belong. Circumstances can be changed, he said, a determined look in his eyes. He scribbled a number on a napkin. My personal line. I have a feeling my associate, Mr. Thorne, will need to speak with you. When he does, I suggest you call me first. A woman with your intellect should have proper counsel. The next morning, the consequences began to rain down on Julian like shards of glass. A multi-billion-dollar merger he had been orchestrating for 6 months was suddenly under review. The lead negotiator, a famously progressive CEO from Sweden, had seen the video. An email leaked to the press by noon quoted her as saying, "We cannot partner with a company whose leadership displays such a profound lack of respect for basic human dignity." The stock of Thorne Industries plummeted 17% at the opening bell. Julian sat in his sterile panoramic office high above the city, watching the numbers on his screen bleed red. His empire was hemorrhaging value because of a riddle, because of a waitress. He had tried to make her a spectacle, and in the end, she had made him one. The irony was so bitter, it felt like poison on his tongue. His board summoned him for an emergency meeting. It was a bloodbath. They were not angry about his cruelty. They were furious about his incompetence. He had exposed the company to ridicule. He had become a liability. They gave him an ultimatum: fix it, publicly and convincingly, or they would invoke the morality clause in his contract and oust him from the company he had built. Fix it. How could he fix it? He couldn't throw money at it. That would only prove her point. He couldn't issue a hollow, corporate-written apology. Everyone would see through it. He had to face her. He had to go back to the woman he had tried to break and somehow ask her to put him back together. He found her name from the restaurant's employment records. Ilara Vance. The name meant nothing to him. He drove himself, in a car less ostentatious than his usual choice, to the address on file. It was a small, run-down apartment building in a part of the city he hadn't visited in decades. The air here smelled of rain and exhaust, a stark contrast to the filtered, climate-controlled world he inhabited. He found her just as she was leaving for her evening shift. Her simple black uniform neatly pressed. She saw him and didn't look surprised, merely weary. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice flat. "Miss Vance," he began, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. I need to speak with you." "I'm on my way to work," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I can't afford to be late." The simple, pragmatic statement struck him with the force of a physical blow. While he was losing billions in theoretical value, she was worried about the hourly wage that kept a roof over her head. "Then I will walk with you," he said, a desperate edge to his voice. And so the billionaire, stripped of his entourage and his armor of arrogance, walked beside the waitress through the darkening city streets. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken wreckage of the night before. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice raw. "What you said about the secret, the burden, how did you know?" Ilara glanced at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the street lamps. "Because everyone has one," she said softly. "The only difference is the price." He stopped, forcing her to turn and face him. The usual mask of command had fallen away, revealing a man who looked lost and profoundly broken. "My riddle," he confessed, the words tasting like ash. "It wasn't just a game. It was about my sister." He told her then, the story pouring out of him in a torrent of long-suppressed grief. He spoke of his younger sister, Amelia, a vibrant, brilliant artist who had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive disease. He had thrown all his money at it, hired the best doctors in the world, funded entire research wings, but it had been useless. His fortune was as effective as a handful of sand against a tidal wave. She had died, and his money, the thing he believed could solve any problem, had been proven worthless. "My wealth became my secret," he whispered, his voice cracking. "A secret burden. Everyone saw a powerful man, but I was just the boy who couldn't save his sister. The money was a monument to my failure. That was the secret I was asking you about, the one that brings no joy." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for, he didn't know what. Absolution? Understanding? Ilara listened, her calm exterior unruffled, but inside a cold storm was gathering. A feeling of dreadful, chilling familiarity washed over her. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine, soul-deep agony of his loss, and for a moment she felt a flicker of empathy. It was a pain she knew all too well. "I understand loss, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice quiet but laced with an intensity that made him flinch. "I understand secrets. My secret is that I am not a waitress. I was a professor of philosophy. I had a husband, David, and I had a daughter. Her name was Lily." She spoke of the life that had been stolen from her. She described her husband's laugh, the way her daughter's hair smelled like summer. And then she described the accident. A rainy Tuesday afternoon. A silver sports car driving far too fast, swerving wildly across the center line. The sickening crunch of metal. The silence that followed. "The police report said the other driver died on impact as well," Ilara continued, her voice hollowed out by memory. "A young woman. They said her family was very powerful, very private. They made sure her name was never released to the press. They settled everything quickly, quietly. A secret, you see, to protect her memory." Julian stood frozen on the grimy sidewalk, the sounds of the city fading into a distant roar. A cold, horrifying certainty was crystallizing in his mind. He felt the blood drain from his face. "When?" he choked out, the word barely audible. "When was this accident?" 5 years ago, Ilara said. October 12th. The date hit Julian like a physical blow. October 12th, the day Amelia had taken their father's silver sports car after a terrible argument about her treatment. The day she had driven off into the rain, half mad with grief and despair. The day she had died. He had been the one to orchestrate the cover-up. He had used his money and influence to seal the police reports, to pay off the journalists, to ensure the Thorne family name was never connected to the other deaths. He had done it to protect his parents, to preserve the memory of his sister as a tragic victim, not the cause of a tragedy. He had buried the truth so deep, he had almost convinced himself it never happened. He looked at Ilara, and he did not see a waitress. He saw the ghost of his own buried sin, the woman whose life he had destroyed to protect the sanctity of his own grief. His secret, the one he thought was his burden alone, had a price he never knew he was paying. And that price was her entire world. The realization crashed down on him with the force of a collapsing building, crushing the last vestiges of his pride, his anger, his self-pity. There was only a vast, black chasm of guilt. The pain he had carried for his sister was now horribly intertwined with the pain he had inflicted on this woman. They were bound together by a shared tragedy, a fated, terrible connection that he himself had forged and then hidden away. "It was her," he whispered, the words tearing from his throat. "My sister. Her name was Amelia." Ilara's composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She did not weep with rage or hatred, but with a sorrow so profound it seemed to contain all the world's suffering. She had spent 5 years hating a nameless, faceless driver. Now that driver had a name, and a brother whose pain mirrored her own. The neat lines of her tragedy, of victim and perpetrator, had blurred into an incomprehensible tangle of shared human suffering. There, on a broken city street, under the indifferent glow of a flickering street lamp, the billionaire and the waitress stood together. Two souls shipwrecked by the same storm. His carefully constructed world had been a lie, and her humble existence was the truth he had been running from all along. The path forward from such a revelation was not clear. It was a dark and treacherous landscape, choked with the thorns of guilt and grief. For Julian Thorne, the choice was stark. He could retreat back into his fortress of wealth, using his power to bury this new, more terrible truth, just as he had buried the old one. Or he could finally face the debt he owed, a debt that could never be repaid with money. In the days that followed their devastating confession on the street, Julian did not go to his office. He did not answer the frantic calls from his board. He went to the one person he now trusted to tell him the unvarnished truth. Alistair Finch. He laid the entire story bare. The riddle, Ilara's past, his sister's role in the accident, his cover-up. He confessed it all, not as a strategist seeking a solution, but as a broken man seeking guidance. Alistair listened without interruption, his expression grim. When Julian finished, the old man was silent for a long time. "Redemption, Julian," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, "is not a transaction. It is not a PR campaign. It is a long, painful, and public act of rebuilding. You did not just humiliate a woman in a restaurant. You built your peace of mind on the ruins of her life. You cannot fix that with a check." Julian knew this. The thought of offering Ilara money now seemed like the most obscene insult imaginable. It had to be something more. It had to be an act of profound and meaningful atonement. He spent a week in seclusion, poring over the details of his sister's life and the fragments he knew of Ilara's. Amelia had been an artist, a woman who saw the world in color and emotion. Ilara had been a philosopher, a woman who saw the world in patterns of ethics and ideas. His own world had been one of numbers and power. The collision had been catastrophic. The atonement had to be a fusion, a way to honor them both. He liquidated a significant portion of his personal assets, not company stock, but his own wealth. He sold his penthouse, his collection of rare cars, his private jet. He funneled the hundreds of millions of dollars into a new entity. He called his lawyers, not to defend him, but to help him build. He called Ilara. He did not summon her. He asked if she would be willing to meet him in a neutral place, a small public library. When she arrived, she found him not at a grand table, but sitting in a simple wooden chair, surrounded by books. In front of him were blueprints and legal documents. "I am not here to ask for your forgiveness," he began, his voice steady but stripped of all its former arrogance. "That is not mine to ask for. I am here to show you what I must do." He explained his plan. He was establishing a foundation. It was not to be a typical, self-aggrandizing monument to a billionaire's ego. Its purpose was twofold. The first branch would be the Lily Vance Fund, a comprehensive support system for victims of tragic accidents, providing financial aid, grief counseling, and long-term educational grants to help people rebuild their lives. The second branch would be the Amelia Thorne Institute for Applied Ethics. It would be a think tank and educational center, dedicated to integrating philosophical and ethical principles into business leadership. It would fund university programs, host public debates, and work to change the very culture of cutthroat capitalism that he had once championed. "I built an empire on the idea that worth is a number," he told her, his eyes filled with a sincerity she could not doubt. "I was wrong. True worth lies in what we build for others, not what we hoard for ourselves. This foundation, it's the only thing I can build that might have any real value." He pushed a final document across the table. It was the Foundation's charter. "This cannot work without the right leadership," he said. "It needs a moral compass. It needs someone who understands both profound loss and profound wisdom. It needs a director who cannot be bought, who understands the difference between price and worth." He looked at her. "I am asking you, Ilara Vance, if you would agree to become the executive director of the Lily and Amelia Foundation, not as my employee, but as its guardian. I will be a silent benefactor, nothing more. The power, the decisions, the direction, it must all be yours." It was a staggering gesture. He was not just giving her money, he was giving her power. The power to right the wrongs done to people like her. The power to reshape the very world that had broken her. He was handing her the keys to his own redemption, making her the arbiter of his penance. Ilara looked at the documents, at the names of her daughter and the woman who had inadvertently taken her life, now intertwined in a mission of healing and hope. Revenge had never been in her nature. Justice, however, was another matter. This was not vengeance. This was a form of cosmic, restorative justice that was almost poetic in its symmetry. She could refuse. She could walk away and let him wallow in his guilt. But she saw a chance to create a legacy for her daughter, to turn her unspeakable pain into a force for good that could help thousands. She saw a chance to reclaim her own purpose, to be Professor Vance again, but on a much grander stage. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and strong. 2 years passed. The world, with its short memory, had largely forgotten the viral video of a billionaire's humiliation. But the world was being quietly changed by its consequences. The Lily and Amelia Foundation was a triumph. Under Ilara's guidance, it became a national model for victim support and ethical leadership. The Lily Vance Fund had helped hundreds of families navigate the financial and emotional wreckage of tragedy, providing them with the second chances Ilara herself had never received. The Amelia Thorne Institute had endowed chairs at 3 major universities, and its annual ethics summit became a must-attend event for a new generation of business leaders who wanted to build companies with a conscience. Ilara Vance was no longer an invisible waitress. She was a celebrated public figure, a powerful advocate for compassion in a world that often had too little. She moved with the same quiet dignity as before, but now it was amplified by a palpable sense of purpose. She had found her voice again, and she used it to speak for those who had none. The final scene of this chapter of their lives took place not in an opulent restaurant, but in a brightly lit university auditorium. Ilara stood at a podium, delivering the keynote address at the Institute's 2nd annual summit. The room was filled with students, executives, and journalists, all listening with rapt attention. In the back row, almost hidden in the shadows, sat Julian Thorne. He was no longer the CEO of his company. He had stepped down, handing the reins to a successor chosen with Alistair Finch's guidance. He now served as a full-time, unpaid volunteer for the foundation, managing logistics and crunching numbers in a small, windowless office. He was thinner, with lines of humility etched around his eyes. The predatory gleam was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful sadness. He had lost an empire, but was slowly, painstakingly, finding a soul. Ilara's voice filled the auditorium, calm and resonant. She was not speaking of balance sheets or market shares. She was speaking of human connection. "We are taught to measure our lives by what we accumulate," she said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Wealth, power, status. We treat these things as a shield against the chaos of the world. But our shields are an illusion. Life is fragile. Sooner or later, the storm comes for all of us. And when it does, our shields will not save us." She paused, her eyes finding Julian's in the back of the room for just a moment. A flicker of understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the storm they had both weathered. "What saves us," she continued, "is not what we have, but what we give. What saves us are the connections we forge in our shared vulnerability. Our true worth is not found in our strength, but in our capacity to see and soothe the wounds in others. For it is often the case that their wounds are a reflection of our own. True wealth is the empathy we extend to a fellow human being, the courage to admit our mistakes, and the grace to build something beautiful and new from the wreckage of our deepest sorrows." When she finished, the auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. It was a roar of genuine, heartfelt admiration. Julian did not clap. He simply sat there, tears streaming down his face, not of sadness, but of a hard-won, cathartic peace. He was not redeemed. He knew that was a lifelong process, but he was on the path. Later, as people crowded around Ilara, he slipped out a side door. He did not need to speak to her. Their connection was now beyond words. He had started with a cruel riddle, demanding to know the nature of a worthless treasure. And in the end, she had given him the answer. Not with a single word, but with her entire life. She had shown him that the only treasure of any real value is the one you give away.